You're listening to A Mighty Fortress, celebrating 500 years of Lutheranism.
A mighty fortress it is our God, a trusty shield and weapon.
Hello and welcome to A Mighty Fortress. I'm your host, Vicar Jake Zabel of the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church, or the AELC. Over these next weeks, A Mighty Fortress is going to be doing a 7-part series on the issue of cloning. Last week, I gave a brief introduction to cloning, and this week, I'm going to be looking at one of my 4 foundational questions. And on today's episode, I'm going to be starting with the first of my 4 foundational questions regarding how we understand clones politically, socially, theologically, and etc. Just to recap, I have 4 foundational questions that I want to be going through. The first is, do clones have an individual personhood? 2. Do clones possess original sin? 3. Do clones possess the image of God? And 4. Do clones possess an individual soul? On today's episode, we'll be tackling question number 1. Do clones possess an individual personhood? And so this is important to understand because in order to understand any theological or political implications of cloning, we need to establish, are clones individuals or are they simply just replicas of their donor? Now, if you've got any questions or comments for the topic of cloning, you can email the show at amightyfortresspodcast@yahoo.com.au. I'd be looking forward to any questions or comments. I'm looking forward to any questions or comments regarding this topic. If you do email the show, I will read out your questions on the next episode after I've received your email, and I will respond to the questions on that episode. I just want to issue a disclaimer before I go into this topic. In this topic of cloning, because I'm going to be going through medical procedures and the scientific procedures, I'm going to be talking about things like eggs and sperm and sex and stuff like that. So I just want to put this disclaimer out there that this is not an episode for children. This series of episodes should not be listened to by children unless they're going to be parental guidance and you as a parent think that they are mature enough and wise enough to listen to this content. Otherwise, I would recommend that you don't let your children listen to this. So if you are one of those parents that do let your children listen to episodes of A Mighty Fortress, probably don't let them listen to these ones on cloning. Or, probably better yet, listen to the episode yourself and then decide whether or not your child is ready to listen to the episode or not. So that's just my disclaimer, and now I'm going to get into this episode where we answer the question, do clones possess their own individual personhood? So to start off, I want to talk about a term known as natural clones. So I'm putting clones in an air quote here because they're not the same as clones, but people talk about identical twins, also known as monozygotic twins, as being natural clones. Now, what they mean by this is that in the process of cloning, there are generally 2 different ways that clones can occur. You've got your fraternal clones, which take place when the woman produces 2 separate eggs on her cycle, and each egg is fertilized at the same time. Thus, you have 2 separate fertilized embryos growing in the womb at the same time. However, monozygotic twins, identical twins, are those that come from a single zygote, hence the term monozygotic. So a zygote is the term for a fertilized egg or an embryo. And so what happens with this is when the sperm hits the egg, that fertilizes the egg becomes an embryo, it starts replicating, starts producing a child, and sometimes during replication, the zygote then splits in 2. And therefore, you've got 2 life forms that are being produced by a single egg and a single sperm. Thus, you've got 2 life forms that share the same DNA, the same genomes, and the same genetic structure. And so these natural clones actually are important for how we understand cloning, because natural clones have the same issue that you will have with cloning. With identical twins, you've got two life forms that share the same DNA. Now, when you have cloning, you have the donor and the clone. And they, while they may be years apart, do share the same DNA, the same genome, and the same genetic structure. So, therefore, the way that we understand identical twins impacts the way we understand donors and clones. Also, therefore, how we understand cloning will thus have implications for how we understand identical twins. So this issue of cloning, while it may not be currently occurring, we do have identical twins walking around everywhere, and it may be important to answer some questions about how we understand identical twins since they both came from a single egg. How do we understand them politically? How do we understand them theologically? And so, cloning is very different from twinning, because unlike clones, twins are not copies of one another, but they come from the same egg, and so they've split at the same time, and you can't really grab two identical twins and say, well, that one was the original and that one split off from the other one, so therefore that one's the copy of that one. You can't really say that with clones. They're two distinct individuals that came from the same egg, neither being a copy of the other. However, when you do have clones, the clone is a copy of the donor. So that does create some different implications for this whole process. So clones face a different reality to identical twins, because the identical twins are formed at the same time from the same egg, and neither is the source of the other. Also, in addition to this, twins are produced from a zygote, a fertilized egg, while clones are produced from a manipulated oocyte, or an unfertilized egg. Like I said in the previous episode, how the process of cloning happens is that first of all, they take an egg, they wipe the DNA in it, insert the DNA from like a blood cell or something, and then they manipulate the egg or the oocyte to replicate so that it functions like a zygote, so that it functions like a fertilized egg. They have actually, in this sense, created life without the use of sperm. So that's also a big difference between clones and twins, because clones are born through a spermless procedure. Clones exist without sperm, whereas twins are created from the normal process of sperm and egg mixing together. On this, so in the same way that clones are produced without, therefore, in this way, clones are produced without a sperm, and therefore they experience a number of theological issues involving original sin in the image of God that identical twins never have to face, since twins are produced from sperm, but clones are produced from a spermless procedure. However, like I said, issues on the individual personhood and on the individual soul are two questions that are relative to both identical twins and both clones, since they both share the same DNA and genetic structure. So in regards to identity and individuality, identical clones are probably the best window we have into understanding how we understand the individual personhood of clones. And so, my first question when it comes to cloning is, do clones possess an individual personhood? This question would seem like an easy yes. However, not everybody sees it this way. See, some people go that clones aren't individual persons because they are copies. However, I would argue that, how are they not individual persons? They're two separate, distinct people. We can, as one author said, we can clone or copy genes, but we cannot clone or copy the organism. Every organism, and certainly every human person, whether they are a clone or not, is unique. However, like I said, some people don't see it this way. Some people identify human individuality solely with the genetic identity. Thus, therefore, if you share the same DNA with clone and donor, then they're the same person, argue some people. However, that seems illogical, because if you follow that logic, we'd have to say that identical twins are the same person because they share identical DNA. As one author said, some people assume that for a person to have individual identity, they must have their own individual genome. Like I said, this is nonsensical. Clones share completely different bodies, so of course they possess their own individual personhood. See, most religious participants recognize that each clone is a unique expression of the interplay between genes and environment, and therefore a clone would not simply be a carbon copy of the person that they came from. A person created through cloning is unique in many ways. See, there are genotypes, that's genetics traits, and phenotypes, your environmental traits. And these are not the same thing. Genotypes are those things that you're born with, those things that shape your life because that's your genetic coding, that's how you were born. You're born white, you're born black, you're born with blue eyes, you're born with brown eyes. Those are genotypes. But phenotypes are things that are environmental traits, things you pick up from how you were raised. Who were your parents? Were you in a rich household or a poor household? Were you abused? Were you loved? Did you have brothers? Did you have sisters? Were you an only child? These things are all phenotypes. These are things that shape your personality and your personhood based on the environment around you. And so a clone may be able to be a copy of a person's genotype, but you can't clone a phenotype. A clone will always have the different experiences. They'll be raised in a different uterus, they'll have a different family, they'll be brought up in a different society, and because of the fact that if you take like a 40-year-old person and then you clone them, the clones are going to grow in completely different times and places. So clones have different phenotypes, just like identical twins. Identical twins have the same genotypes, but they're different people. But even though they're most likely raised in the same household, in the same environment, by the same parents, they still will have different experiences and they will grow up differently. So clones would have different phenotypes, a different sense of self, different thought process, and a different ethical responsibility. Their biological uniqueness would remain, let alone their spiritual uniqueness, which lies in their relationship to God. Our value rests upon a dignity bestowed by God and is independent of our genetic status. Our identity before God comes from God's ongoing grace and from our desire, or lack of it, to live in close communion with Him. This is not biologically based. When it comes to understanding individual personhood, we can learn a lot from identical twins. Even though identical twins have come from the same zygote, develop in the same womb, share the same DNA, same genome, same genotype, they are separate and unique individuals. Each twin possesses their own interior consciousness, their own sense of self, their own thought process, and their own ethical responsibility. Despite having parents that may dress them alike and treat them alike, they will grow up as separate, distinct individuals. Environment plays an important role in a person's development. Twins may be very similar in many ways, but they are very different, unique individuals with unique traits and personalities. The reality of identical twins are a perfect example of individual personhood for clones. Clones are nothing more than a twin delayed in time. They are both individual persons with their own self-consciousness. So I think it is quite clear to say that yes, clones do possess their own individual personhood. They may share genetic information with another person, but personally they are different people. They have different thoughts, they have different bodies, they have different brains, they will think and act differently. So I think the answer is a clear yes. Clones do possess a separate personhood. So on my next episode, I'm going to be going through the issue of do clones possess original sin? However, before I finish off this episode, I have also inserted a section here between personhood and original sin called Biblical Examples of Cloning. Again, I'm using cloning in air quotes here because I'm loosely using the term cloning. This section is related to both personhood and original sin, and it's kind of related to the whole paper. I've inserted it here because I thought it was an important piece of information to help us understand personhood and also work as a good introduction into original sin. Because I've still got plenty of time left for this episode, I'm going to go through this section on biblical examples of cloning now in this episode, and we'll pick up original sin in next week's episode. So, let's begin. Biblical examples of cloning. There are two issues that emerge when we try to use the case of identical twins to understand theological implications of cloning. The first is that identical twins are born from a fertilized zygote and clones are born from an unfertilized oocyte. The second issue is the complete lack of biblical examples of identical twins. There are three sets of twins mentioned in the Bible: Jacob and Esau, Perez and Zerah, and Thomas and his twin. Of these three cases, it is unknown whether any of them were identical twins. In fact, by studying the text, it is clear to the reader that Jacob and Esau were fraternal twins and not identical twins because they were so different genetically. Esau has more red-skinned, he was more dark-skinned and hairy, whereas Jacob tended to be softer, less hairy, and more fair-skinned. However, Scripture does present us with two cases of incidents that are similar to cloning and could possibly be considered forms of cloning. That's the creation of Eve and the virgin birth of Jesus. Now I'm going to preface this by saying that neither of these are cases of clonings, at least not in the sense of how we understand cloning now. However, they are similar to cloning in the sense that, as I believe, both Eve and Jesus were born sharing the genetic DNA type of another. Eve was a genetic clone of Adam, and Jesus was a genetic clone of Mary. To understand this, Eve received her DNA from Adam. She was created from Adam's rib. Adam was the donor who provided the DNA for Eve, and Jesus, according to theology, Jesus received his physical body from Mary. Throughout the history of the church, theologians have taught that Jesus' humanity came solely from Mary. Therefore, Jesus' DNA would be a copy of Mary's DNA. Now, there are some slight differences in both these cases, and like I said, these are not cloning in the sense that we talk about cloning now, because these are both miraculous, divine acts of cloning produced by God. I want to preface this by going that these are descriptive accounts and not prescriptive accounts. Here, these are divine events of cloning done by God, and they are not meant to be commands for us to do. Just because God cloned Eve from Adam does not give us humans the right to clone each other. The accounts of the creation of Eve and the virgin birth of Jesus are descriptive accounts. They are not prescribed to us to replicate or to even try and replicate. To try and create life through the process of cloning is trying to play God. And so, I would like to just preface it by going that these are not the same types of cloning that we are experiencing now, and they're very different from the somatic cell nuclear transfer that I talked about. However, I do believe that both of these cases are similar to cloning, and they do shed some theological light on the issue of cloning. And I'm going to deal with the account of Jesus' virgin birth later when I tackle the issue of original sin, but now in this part, as a preface to original sin and also as a follow-on from the personhood section, I'm going to talk about the creation of Eve and show how that it can shed some theological light on the issue of a clone's individual personhood. In Genesis 2:22, God created Eve from the genetic material of Adam's rib. And so recent biological research confirms the feasibility of a woman being created from a man. See, women possess an XX chromosome while men possess an XY. When cloning a person with an XX genetic material, you'll only ever be able to produce another female. However, scientists have proposed that if you were to take genetic material from a person who is XY, so a man, it is possible to remove the Y chromosome and duplicate the X chromosome to produce a female instead of a male. Thus, you can produce female clones from a male. So it is scientifically possible, or it's hypothetically possible, to take the cells of a man and clone a female from him, thus producing a female that would have the exact same DNA as the man that she was cloned from. The difference would be that she would be lacking the Y chromosome. So, genetically speaking, Eve would possess the same DNA as Adam, except she would be lacking the Y chromosome. Just as it is hypothetically possible to take one of my blood cells and produce a clone that is lacking my Y chromosome but is still possessing the rest of my DNA. Thus, it is possible to clone a female that would be an exact DNA genetic replica of myself. And so, genetically speaking, Eve would have been a genetic copy of Adam, except that she lacked his Y chromosome. However, she would share the same DNA as him. And so Eve's creation is a special divine creation, very different to modern day cloning. However, like modern day cloning, she would have been produced not from a zygote, and therefore she would have possessed the same genetic material as her donor. Therefore, my point that I'm trying to say is here that Eve and Adam shared the same genome, they shared the same genetic structure, they shared the same DNA, yet it is clear from scripture that Adam and Eve were very distinct human beings. They both thought differently, they both acted differently, and they both had very different lives. So therefore, I think it is clear just logically and also theologically that clones do possess an individual personhood. They are unique, distinct humans. They are different from their donor, and clones should be treated not as replicas or copies of their donor, but they should be treated as a unique individual human being with the same rights and responsibilities of any other human. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of A Mighty Fortress, where we've gone through the individual personhood of clones. Join us next week when we tackle the question of, do clones possess original sin? I've been your host, Knight Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.